That's a defaced Union Jack. You're not allowed to deface our flag.
1 week to the Commons vote and tensions are high outside and inside the Commons.
It's really strange. I mean, you know, in all the years any of us have been involved here, I've never seen a situation where there are, you know, so many fingers firmly in so many ears. Nothing you can say is breaking the deadlock at the moment.
Did you hold a punch to me, sir? I did not. I'm pushing you away from...
After yet another question and answer session by the Prime Minister, a rare statement by the highly theatrical Attorney General, her warm-up act at the party conference.
Mr. Speaker, it's very good of the Prime Minister to warm up for me today.
MPs wanted to know if Britain could leave the backstop provision in the draft Brexit treaty whenever it chooses.
There is, therefore, no unilateral right for either party to terminate this arrangement.
It's a trap, one Tory MP shouted. The Chancellor gave a withering look.
There is no question that the absence of a right of termination of the backstop presents a legal risk. The question of whether it is one this House should take is a matter of political and policy judgment that each one of us must grapple with.
MPs had voted demanding to see the full legal opinion the Attorney-General gave the government. He said that broke convention and would not happen.
It's no use the baying and shouting of members opposite. What I am trying to do is guard the public interest. That's all. What part of that proposition is the other side incapable of understanding?
At stake today are really serious issues, and yet this House is descending into farce, into some kind of amateur dramatics.
Get off our flag! Get out of the way! Who are you talking to? You want
With tempers fraying inside and outside the House, opposition parties wrote to the Speaker saying the government was in contempt of Parliament for not publishing the legal advice as demanded. Divisions are on display in meetings around the country. At Shepton Mallet in Somerset, Tory MP James Heapy tells voters he's backing the deal.
Why can we not have no deal and go with the WTO, which offers us everything we ask for at the referendum?
It puts us completely over a barrel, with control being given to Monsieur Macron and his Spanish colleagues and all the rest of them.
Since the referendum, over 1 million electors have died. And we know most of those electors were Brexiters. And since the referendum, this is inescapable fact. You can dispute it if you like.
I get people sort of popping up on my Facebook sort of saying, oh, you're just a sort of quisling, obeying the whip and everything else. And it's like, well, at no time in the last few decades could that be less true of what's going on in Parliament right now. It is almost every man and woman for themselves.
The crisis has even invaded the serenity of daytime TV.
In 2 weeks' time, will you be booking a holiday? Do you think you'll still have a job in 2 weeks' time?
I will still have a job in 2 weeks' time.
Definitely?
And my job is making sure that we do what the public asked us to. We leave the EU, but we do it in a way that's good for them.
Does it look to you at the moment as though the government, the Prime Minister, is running at speed towards a brick wall?
Well, sadly, I think it is, yes. I mean, it's quite clear that this vote is going to go against the government, and if we're to believe the numbers, it looks like by a very large majority the government will be defeated.
Not just the deal, she's done for then as well. They're both done for, aren't they?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister has made this her deal. She's been very clear that this is her deal.
They go together.
And I think that if the vote is lost by the majority it seems to be, then clearly that raises a question about her future, and I think she has to consider that.
Hey, look at this! Look at this! Thank you! I'm free. Oh, look!
The shift in opinion number 10 was banking on has not happened. If anything, the numbers for the Commons vote are getting worse, with only 7 days to go.
Well, I'm joined now by the Government Solicitor General, Conservative MP Robert Buckland. How does it feel to be running towards a brick wall?
Well, I think it's important that we keep on making the case. The Prime Minister has gone the length and breadth of the country. She's making the case to MPs. It's clear to me and to many other MPs that we now need to resolve Brexit in a way that delivers the result of the referendum, but in a way that makes sure that when we leave in a sensible and smooth way.
So the vote will definitely go ahead on the 11th. There's no cancelling this in the face of the likelihood of loss.
Well, no, I mean, it's going to be a long debate, Chris. It's going to start tomorrow. We'll have 5 days of debate. I think 8 hours a day has been set aside, so the votes must happen.
Right, so let's just clarify. We will be stuck, won't we? If the backstop is triggered, we have no unilateral right to leave it.
That's correct, but remember this, that the context of the backstop is vital. Neither us nor the EU want it. It's very much an insurance policy. It's there because the Belfast Agreement is of paramount importance to everybody on the island of Ireland and in the wider world, and that's why it is in the particular state that it is. We can't get around that.
But in 2 years we haven't got a deal. So if in another 2 years or in 4 years we still haven't got a deal, the backstop is triggered, and that's it. We're stuck in it forever, really.
Well,
what was amazing was today that Geoffrey Cox, your legal boss, if you like, admitted that your only hope of getting out of it is by applying to the European Court of Justice.
No, I think the important point of this is the context of it. The context of it is underpinned by Article 50. It's understood by both parties that this is a temporary solution. Remember, the EU hate the idea of a free backdoor to the single market, which is what the backstop
represents. But what's the way out? If it's temporary,
right.
What's the way out if you don't have a deal?
Well, the way out is via the arbitral mechanism, which can lead to withdrawal. It seems to me that the other way out would be, well, through the arbitration mechanism, which, of course, exists within the protocol that underpins the backstop. The other way out would, of course, be a fresh agreement by the parties to agree to terminate it. I think there's been lots of talk about denouncing the treaty. I don't think that's
if both sides agree to terminate it.
Yes, that's right.
We know that the EU won't do that because it would lead to a hard border in Northern Ireland. So if the EU don't agree to terminate it, we are stuck in it. That's what this legal advice reveals, isn't it?
Yes, and the attorney was absolutely frank on the floor of the House. He talked about the risk. But I agree with him. I think the risk is worth taking because I do not believe we will get there. I think we will get the deal.
How long do we live under the auspices of the European Court?
Well, it depends on particular issues. There are particular issues arising from the withdrawal agreement about, for example, outstanding cases or issues that arise under it. It's like any other limitation period. You have a reasonable period of time.
What's the longest?
References. The longest would be 8 years with regard to EU citizens' rights.
From when?
Set that out. 8 years in the case of one particular aspect of rights from the beginning of, from the end of March of 2020, and 8 years from the end of the implementation period for other aspects of EU citizens' rights.
So the implementation period could be 4 years long, couldn't it?
Well,
so you're talking about 8 years from the end of 4 years. So we're talking about 12 years under the European Court.
But remember why, Christian? Because we were talking about underpinning the rights of EU citizens here. Everybody from Eurosceptics right through the political spectrum agreed that it was the fair thing to do. The jurisdiction of the court is limited in dramatically different ways.
And just to be clear, no trade deals during any of this period, is there?
Oh, no, we can prepare, we can
sign any.
We can.
That begin?
We can, but we can't implement until the end of the deal.
So we can't have any trade deals until...
Look, what is the problem with all of this? We're trying to leave the EU in a sensible and rational way. Like any end of a relationship, it doesn't just end bang like that. It takes time for things to move on.
Some people think sensible and rational is impossible, given what you've laid out.
Well, I disagree. I think it is the sensible and rational option. And in this fevered time when everybody's getting, excited about the detail, let's look at the bigger picture here. We're leaving the EU in March, at the end of March.
Maybe.
It is going to happen, and the way in which we do it is vital, and this is why the deal is worth supporting.
Customs House, for centuries, the cash-collecting heart of Britain's international trade. Ships channelled everything from tobacco to wine to wool, while taxes and tariffs were collected from bustling merchants. Those days are long gone, but as Britain prepares to leave the EU, Theresa May today again talked up the prospects of global trade deals.
Once we leave the EU, we can and we will strike ambitious trade deals. For the first time in more than 40 years, we will have an independent trade policy.
We've always been told that free trade deals will help save the day, pick up the economic slack that leaving the EU will have on the UK. But there are many who are now worried that both the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, which forms the basis of our future negotiations, will prevent the UK from ever striking out as a free trading nation. So what precisely are the rules that govern our ability to trade once we leave the EU?
Once the UK leaves the EU next March, Britain is free to negotiate and even sign trade deals with the rest of the world. But crucially, none can be implemented until the transition period ends in December 2020, when, in theory, we've agreed our own trade deal with the EU first.
I'm delighted to be here today to announce the UK-Indonesia partnership.
That's why Liam Fox, the International Trade Secretary, has been globe-trotting, talking trade with anyone who'll give him an audience in places as far-flung as Indonesia, but also the US and 20 other nations on his hit list. But what if we haven't managed to sign a UK-EU trade deal by the end of the transition period? Well, then the transition is either extended or the UK enters the so-called backstop arrangement. This means that technically we leave the EU and the single market, but remain in a customs union with the EU. So while we could sign our own trade deals at this stage, in practice we will have to apply the same tariffs as the EU because we're still tied to Europe, and they don't want us to undercut them with more competitive tariffs of our own. And it's those continuing close ties with Europe that some say will simply put new trade partners off.
Any country that comes to us, the US, Australia, will say to us, well, if we negotiate a deal with you, when will you be able to put it into force? And we'll have to say, well, we don't know. We don't know that. We don't even know the date. We don't know if it's 2020, end of 2022. A number of years after that, we haven't a clue.
But overarching all the worries about the transition and the backstop is a fear from some that the language in the declaration used to describe the future UK-EU trade deal could end up locking us into a permanent customs union with the EU and prevent the UK from signing any free trade deals around the world of its own.
Certainly that seemed to be the conclusion of President Trump last week, who poured cold water on the prospects of our most lucrative trade deal.
I think we have to take a look at seriously whether or not the UK is allowed to trade, because, you know, right now, if you look at the deal, they may not be able to trade with us.
A deal the EU wants to build and improve on the single customs territory. The words in the political declaration that for some ominously point not to liberation, but to ever closer trade ties with Europe.
Well, from the House of Commons, we're joined by Conservative MP Dominic Grieve, who served as Attorney-General and wants a second vote. Labour's shadow Brexit Minister Jenny Chapman. We'll hear from them in a moment. First, let's talk to Conservative Andrew Bridgen, who campaigned to leave the EU. Well, did the Attorney-General win you over?
I mean, he's an excellent performer in the chamber. He has a voice as rich as a Devon cream tea, but it's the contents of the summary of the legal recommendations was pretty damning at the end of the day. We're not going to be able to leave unilaterally the backstop. We're going to have many, many vetoes on the future relationship. If you look at the way the...
So he's made it worse?
He had to come and make his statement. I wonder how bad the original recommendations and advice could have been when you look at the summary being as bad as it is.
Well,
for the
do you
government.
think he's in contempt of Parliament? Because that's where this is moving now.
Whether that's his decision or the government's decision, ultimately the Speaker's going to take a look tonight, and I think it's pretty sure the Speaker will announce there'll be a debate tomorrow and a division as to whether the government are in fact in contempt.
How will you vote?
I will listen. I do have some sympathy with the national interest and national security, but I think it's difficult for the government not to release the original advice when the Cabinet have accepted and supported the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement.
Sounds like you're edging towards holding them in contempt.
I want to listen to the debate before I commit myself, but there are major concerns.
Thank you very much. Dominic Grieve, let's go to you now in the lobby. Do you think... yes, Dominic Grieve is there. Do you think the government is in contempt?
I think the government has a difficulty in that if Parliament continues to insist that this document be handed over, I think it's going to be very difficult for the government to resist. That said, as I've made perfectly plain in the past, I think that to require the government to hand over the attorney's advice which was the motion 2 weeks ago, was mistaken. I think attorneys must be able to provide confidential advice to government, and the reality is that the document that's been published today is not a summary of the attorney's advice. It's probably much more extensive than the attorney's advice, and I do suspect that it's unlikely that the attorney's advice is going to disclose anything different in terms of the legal analysis in relation to Brexit. The attorney made the point, which was a fair one, that attorney's advice may often contain extraneous material relating to other issues which may be very difficult for the government to put in the public domain, including, for example, the attitude of allies or associates or other states.
Okay.
So this is a very difficult issue, but constitutionally it's right to say that if the House of Commons insists tomorrow that it sees the advice, then in those circumstances I think the government is in great difficulty in not handing it over,
right,
even if I might disagree with that decision.
I mean, it is a sort of a constitutional side issue. The big question is Brexit. Do you think we're heading for the deal being defeated, and do you think we're heading for a second referendum?
It certainly looks likely that the deal being offered by the Prime Minister, which has been negotiated by her in good faith, I think is likely to be defeated, because I think Parliament is going to conclude that it's unsatisfactory. That's not her fault. It's an inherently unsatisfactory situation because it devolves from an inherently unsatisfactory decision, which was to leave the EU in the expectation that we would get some sort of acceptable deal, when it always seemed to me we were going to replace one set of international treaty obligations with another, which is exactly what is about to happen, except it is now disadvantageous for us. Where we should go after that is, I don't know. Parliament will have to decide. But if Parliament wishes this matter to go back to the public, it will go back to the public. And my view is that we should send it back to the public, because otherwise we are just going to mire ourselves in chaos. And I think it's the only sensible way out.
Jenny Chapman, are you going to come off the fence for your part and back a second referendum, or are you going to tell us we need to have a general election and then we'll see where we are? All options are on the table.
You've got the line just right there.
OK. We can leave you there then if you like.
Well,
unless you...
our position, as you've quite nicely explained, is that we think that if the Prime Minister comes to the House and she is heavily defeated, as it looks as though she will be, that actually that is a point of crisis politically, if not constitutionally, and that a general election would be an appropriate course of action. If that is not possible, or the House of Commons declines to take that option, then there are other options available, and we will explore each and every one. Yes, there are.
Right,
yes.
OK. Thank you for telling us other options are available.
Yes.
What about the contempt sort of debate tomorrow? Do you think that's likely to go through?
We don't know. We need to wait and hear the Speaker's response to our letter today. I think that actually what happened today is very serious, and the House of Commons voted unanimously for a particular course of action, and the government is choosing so far to ignore that vote. Now that is serious, and I think the Attorney General knows it, and he will be considering his own way forward when he writes his own letter to the Speaker this evening too.
Well, Jenny Chapman, thank you very much indeed. Dominic Grieve, thank you for joining us, and Andrew Bridgen as well.